Hello, everyone. Welcome to your extra episode of the War Report this week. Now, this is normally a treat we save for big events, which is why we're here. And man, I don't even know where to start. This is sort of picking up from last time, just the absolute chaos of last time. But I suppose we could start with just the state on the ground in Afghanistan has not improved in the slightest. Some of the more recent news we have transportation planes taking off with half the cargo. And the United States, we're not doing this for foreign civilians. We're not doing this for, refugees, quote unquote, or whatever. We're doing this to American citizens in the country, whether they be State Department workers, journalists, or aid workers, etc. We are making them pledge that they pay back $2,000 when they get stateside or when they get to a secure location. So we're charging plane tickets to evacuate a country that had just been taken over by the worst enemy of the past 75 years. The worst people since the Germans in World War II is what they always tell us. That's what they tell us about every enemy. But it's so unurgent, apparently, that you look at all this and we're charging them to get out. And it looks like the military forces that are still left there are more or less just sting onto the thumbs to the point where British and French special forces are now, fair enough. You have to pull your own weight, whatever. But after we make guarantees more or less to these countries that, oh yeah, we'll take care of the coalition forces and the assorted groups there. For example, if you have British diplomats or French aid workers or whatever, it was more or less understood, maybe as an unspoken agreement, that yeah, America being the main power in this war is going to be responsible for the security and protection of this. And it's to the point where the British and the French had to send in their own forces to aid in the evacuation, while the U.S. military is seemingly doing nothing. Now, again, we'll get into this later, especially talking about the mysterious evacuation from Bagram Air Base, which we have touched on before, but some new information has come to light and some new ideas have come to light on our end at least. So we're going to get into that in a bit here, but again, the botched evacuations continue, the botched process continue. The Taliban again comes across something like 200 American manufactured aircraft because, of course, when they confronted the Afghan army proper, most of them didn't even put up a fight and either defected or, if not outright, joined the Taliban. So they have access to like 200 aircraft, I think like 1,000 tanks, tens of thousands of small arms, mind you, and again, just all this other high grade military equipment, these tens of billions of dollars we've poured into the Afghan National Army, ending up in the hands of the Taliban, keeping them armed to the teeth. I'm sure you've all seen the photo ops of these Taliban guys going into old U.S. warehouses with that are just like stocked with just like M4, M16 rifles that have probably been there again since the beginning of the war, but still much more high tech than anything the Taliban had access to, certainly prior to. And again, I understand you can't evacuate all equipment, but you figured again this is the eternal debate that I think we're going to have that I think is really going to come to a head in this. And not even that like necessarily like you versus me debate, but just like me trying to figure out, I'm sure you're on the same page as me. Was this a matter of gross incompetence, or is there some sort of subterfuge behind this? Are they doing this for a reason? I would say it's a little bit of both coming to a head with, again, the worst traits of both coming out. And with what you see with all of this, it's completely disastrous. It looks like the 80s Soviet Union, if I had to be honest. And I know I've said that about a lot of things, but just this especially. I knew getting out of Afghanistan after, again, this long of time, after this amount of time, was not going to be a smooth or clean process. But it has been so much more chaotic, so much more disastrous than I really could have ever predicted. And just looking at all of this, again, I'm sort of at the point where I am at a loss for words yet again about this entire situation. And of course, this is reverberating out, and this results in, with the recent U.S. withdrawal plan, the British Parliament has held Joe Biden in contempt. They have issued a formal statement denouncing Biden. Now, They described the withdrawal from the country as catastrophic and shameful on Wednesday, and that also includes Boris Johnson, um, who said, "Oh, it was a fault of both sides." Of course, the Taliban is horrible, but the U.S. they could have done a better job withdrawing. But you have a very strong condemnation from the British Parliament. I imagine feeling in other ally countries the same because you still had some residual amount of British forces in the country as well as other forces. And apparently, on this withdrawal, not only did we not inform the commanders or the people who were going to take over Bagram Air Base, we also apparently didn't inform the allies we had in the country at the time, which makes this look like a completely botched operation, to say the least. And of course, you have British chiefs of staff coming out saying this is going to embolden countries like Russia and China, and it's quite strained. And it is interesting because what the YouTube algorithm does, you get all these sort of like recommended things, and it's no surprise recently been recommending a lot of things about like 9/11, and one of the things I've noticed, like particularly in media clips, is it'll show like a lot of clips from the British media and what the British public was at that time. Like you would have think with the reaction of the British public, it happened in London, not New York. And again, I'm not saying that we have this undying obligation to our allies that we must go through, hell or high water for them. But point being is, I can imagine with this that being the sentiments of the British Parliament that the British public feels pretty disillusioned with the U.S. war effort right now and the way it was conducted, and considering the fact that they were more or less left as much in the dark as the Afghans were, which I really don't know which is worse, the one of the closest allies in the United States being left in the dark like that, or the country we're handing over control to being left in the dark by that. But it does bring a whole new angle to the Bagram Air Base thing, watching the absolute chaos at Kabul International Airport. Again, I'm sure you've seen with the civilians clinging onto the aircraft and trying to pry the doors open and get on board and flooding over the runway, as we were discussing last week. Of course, in Biden's challenged by the press on this, he says that was like 4 or 5 days ago. Who cares? And Biden looking as orange as ever. It's a bit surreal.
It was literally 2 days prior, not 4 or 5. Like,
Yeah, like it was really just what you would expect, and I think we're seeing a strong case. As much as I liked Trump, as much as I still kind of wish he was in office, that Biden, all in all, in the end, was the true accelerationist candidate. That now, that being said, I don't think a
yeah,
Biden in 2016 or a Hillary in 2016 would have been accelerationist, but I think by virtue of coming after Trump, especially Biden being Biden and being the alleged mental health state he is in, he was the ultimate accelerationist, and we are seeing that play out. Of course, there's speculations that Biden is going to get thrown under the bus when it comes to Kamala and when it comes to, again, the 25th Amendment, all that kind of stuff. Is Biden mentally fit to hold office? But you were getting into some interesting theories about Bagram Air Base and the exact evacuation there. How, again, we pretty much closed off this other airway that could have at least taken care of military personnel, if not relieved some of the civilian burden on this air base, where we had, it was a U.S. military base. We had complete control of it. Also, these stockpiles of arms, of course, all of which we weren't able to evacuate. But it seems like there was no effort to sabotage or destroy what was left behind, and it was a very quiet. It was quiet and disorderly getting out of Bagram, and this happened prior. We discussed this previously. It happened at 3:15 a.m. We up and leave, pretty much leave a note on the door, sticky note on the door, telling the Afghans that they're in charge now. So it's been a hell of a process, and I'll let you get into more details about the botched Bagram withdrawal.
right. Yeah, I mean, and before I do, this literally just came in an hour ago. So, U.S. Department staff Ned Price has retracted. He has backtracked and says no reimbursements will be required. This literally was just an hour ago from time of recording. I just saw it now. In any case, we talked last week on the program about how this could have gone more smoothly. That the Soviets had several magnitudes more personnel to move out of the country, and in a far longer route than the Americans did. And their four-star generals showed up, something which has not happened who is actually in charge, and why are they no high-profile people from the military overseeing this in a similar way that the Soviets did? So, both parties were committed to the uh, withdrawal. With the Russians, they met with the Mujahideen and their representatives in Geneva, and similarly, the Americans have had an ongoing process with the Taliban. And it should be stated that the Afghan government was not invited for these meetings, and in many respects, that played probably a big role in not fighting the Taliban, because it could easily be mistaken that the U.S. is favoring the Taliban in some ways. But before I go adrift, so let's go back to Bagram, because Bagram uh, was evacuated. What is it now? At least a month ago, right?
I would say
And
about
this
like
is
3 weeks, but yeah, somewhere within that time frame.
yeah, it was in July. I can't remember, or like the end of July, if I'm not mistaken. And so this evacuation, similarly to not notifying anybody, as we saw in Kabul, nobody was notified. So the U.S. forces leave Bagram, and according to AP, um, various munitions are left behind, including other military equipment like armored personnel carriers. And America's armored personnel carriers are probably the finest in the world. These are extremely well made.
Yeah, you ever see the
From
sardine
lessons
cans that
learned.
the Russians pack themselves into?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, they're good, but they're not at the level that the American types are. They're prone to more attack because they're higher, but that's to avoid roadside bombs. And frankly, they just have better armor. In any case, so some of these were left behind. They go on to mention even energy drinks were left behind, probably implying that this was a rash move.
Well,
Now,
in other
the
news, the
fact
Germans
that
went back for their beer, believe it or not. That's what I heard, at least. No joke, you
now
can look it up.
the Germans went back for the beer, the Americans guarded the only McDonald's. So it's like you literally can't make this up. So, like all the tropes are real. So now, Bagram we're seeing as these days develop is turning out to have been probably the most pivotal decision for several reasons. As you mentioned, if Bagram was still open, greater security could have been achieved, and it could have facilitated, like you said, either to alleviate the overcrowding that was happening there. So there would have been 2 points of departures instead of one. It could have also divided between civilian and military personnel, uh, making that easier, making that process easier to complete. But instead, it wasn't. It was just simply abandoned, right? And then what happened was, as the chaos unfolded this past weekend, 2,500, then another 1,000, then another 1,000 had to be recommitted into Afghanistan in order to deal with this, right? And basically, they lost precious time. But more importantly, they lost this base. So the question is, who did this? Whose decision was this? Why did this happen? What does it imply? You can look at it, I think, in two basic ways. One was there was so much hubris and it was considered unnecessary. But now, when you hear about how many thousands of people, just on the American side alone, may not get out of Kabul and Afghanistan, it seems like almost beyond hubris to have closed it down, to have left it for I guess essentially the Taliban. I don't know if I know in the morning the Afghan forces were there. Now they mentioned that there was looting and so on, but two possible scenarios. So one scenario is there's so much hubris. Afghanistan is not going to fall. We don't need it. We'll be able to handle it. So forth, so on. The other is something that could point to treason, and that is they know very well that the drawdown is going to have problems. That that let's say the very act of sneaking away in the night tends to imply a lack of faith both in the Afghan forces or an unwillingness to work with them, and at the same time, uncertainty about the Taliban. So it doesn't bode well. So if they left early, they then must understand what extra kind of chaos this is going to create later down the road. I mean, any I think anybody with an IQ over 100 can figure this out,
That's
right?
even a
So
generous
why
take.
did it?
I'd say over 90 at this rate.
Yeah. So why did it happen? And I think this is probably something that I tend to think will be ignored. They're not going to investigate this, but Bagram is the fact that they're not talking about it. Only in some of the interviews with Biden and some of Biden's speeches imply this leaving of Bagram Air Force Base. It's not mentioned directly. It's just mentioned that the troops were taken out and then they had to be put back in. But that in itself was wasted precious time. So my feeling is that Bagram, in a way, also points to much bigger questions about Afghanistan and about what this will mean, basically, at the very least, to American leadership, but America as a whole, right? Like one of the things that I think you can map out is the growing difference since the Cultural Revolution in America in the late '60s, and then the consequences um, of the Immigration Act of '65, which really didn't begin until the mid '70s, and then you have Clinton's administration basically outlining how they were going to become the dominant party for a very long time because they were going to side with single working women, minorities, and gays. And you can see how that move has absolutely transpired. So there is definitely a cultural gap and a cultural war that we're all very well aware of right now. Obama was, for instance, very careful to get rid of whatever conservative generals he could find in the Pentagon. And Biden is continuing that. One of the reasons why I think Trump couldn't get support is because there wasn't any support. So this
Oh, and you have to remember the
this
military top brass, I'm sure you all know at this point, after this whole year of critical race theory and the comments about the riots during 2020, what we're
Yeah,
looking at right here is, I would say, since the end of the Cold War onwards, when the threat of a conventional war between two great powers dropped off exponentially, the top brass, the generals, the officers, the military, became more of an ideological and political position. Now, of course, being in a position of that much
yeah,
power always carries some sort of weight like that, but it became much less about ability and skill and insight and became more about, do you agree with the current administration? And even Milley, who is the current, again, chief of staff, was hired under Obama, wasn't dismissed under Trump. And look, we're no great defenders of Trump. We have plenty of our criticism. Sure, our longtime viewers know. But for any new viewers out there, it's not like we're infatuated with Trump or Q people or anything like that, if you haven't guessed that already. But I can genuinely believe that he just kept him there because there was no viable replacement. And again,
hmm
like the most quote unquote base generals, the most generals and officers who are on our side are retired ones, like Flynn. And I always go back to that. They tried to make him national security advisor, and look how that turned out. They tried to make
Right.
Douglas McGregor the colonel. He was not, he wasn't even general. He was a colonel, national security advisor or secretary, ambassador to Germany, not secretary of state. But point being is they tried to put him in all these prominent positions, and it just never got off the ground. He never got through the approval process for any of those.
Right.
So whenever you do
Right.
find people who are again more in line with that, they either get completely railroaded by the system or just completely shut down before they even take off and get into those positions. Now that's the story of the entire Trump administration. Don't get me wrong, but again, the idea of a somebody on the more conservative side within our top brass has been a decreasing reality since the 90s. And I would say the Obama administration put the final nail in that coffin in terms of their military policy. And I think it took the absurdity of Trump, like many things, like many uh, flaws in the system, like many, again, things that are bursting at the seams, for that to actually be exposed. And you'll notice nowadays is a lot of the mythology around the military that was very strong with conservatives, especially post 9/11, has become disillusionment. And like this is even I'm talking like even like with veterans and everything. Like say like like I did X amount of years in the army only for this to happen. So again, the disillusionment is growing. I think that plays into the greater point of growing apathy. But point being, it's becoming more and more of a common sentiment among people you would have never expected. Is what I'm getting at.
Right, and I'll tie this in. Those are very important points, and I'll try to tie this in to how this relates to Bagram. And so what I'm trying to outline is the kind of growing division and the power grab that is happening in America. But it's a divided America, and it's happening, at every level. So is what happened in Bagram, um, like I don't buy the argument that this is 4D chess. For instance, they did this, to sow even more discord and chaos in Afghanistan to stop those, to stop Pakistan, China, and those Ruskies from, from taking advantage of Afghanistan. We're going to get them, right? Like a lot of these arguments are really they're bad faith arguments. They're arguments that come out of an extreme sense of bitterness, as it's like a lot of people who make these arguments concede that America does seem to be in a decline, and at the same time, they can't wait for like their rivals to make the same mistakes. But these are just, these are sour grape arguments. The fact is, like, you know, when Afghanistan was going through its civil war in the 90s, China, yeah, sure, China knew uh, that Afghanistan was an important piece on the chessboard, but China wasn't going to go in. China knew that it had no diplomatic front to make inroads
In
there.
fact, during
China
the
knew,
whole debacle with the Buddhist statues that were detonated by the Taliban, that was actually played into the greater negotiations between China and the Taliban even before the U.S. invasion. So again,
yes, yes,
it would
and the
it doesn't
Taliban,
yeah it doesn't make sense in that point of view when even before then the Chinese were more conciliatory to a Taliban government in Afghanistan so long as they could reach
right,
common interest or would stay out of Chinese business, so to speak.
right, and just consider their caution, and those statues, by the way, like the Taliban was asking for more aid. And because they wouldn't give aid and wanted to restore the statues, initially the Taliban was willing to work with NGOs and institutions from the West in order to preserve those Buddhas. But when they were denied money for relief, they said, "The hell with it! Like if you
And
can't relieve these people from starving, we're going to blow them up." And
And
and they,
this is
and they
this is a
did.
bit of a tangent, but I do think it also goes back, especially in the '90s, early 2000s, this weird post-Christian West's infatuation with Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism,
Yeah,
and again the fact that like I know there isn't a any there isn't a big, if any, Christian population at all in Afghanistan. But if they would have blown up some historic church there, I doubt you would have gotten nearly the amount of outrage, even in '90s Western world, even in '90s
Oh yeah.
America, than you would over big Buddha statue. When again, how much of the West, how much of the United States, even at that point, did you what do you think is Buddhist? And even by that point, pre 9/11, it's strange how the immigration laws changed. Most
Right.
Asians in America were some form of Christian, usually like either Korean Protestants or Filipino Catholics or Vietnamese Catholics. So again, it's this weird thing, and I think it just goes back to one of these other pathologies in the West, where it's like again like this infatuation to defend the foreign over their own interest, or go out of their way to, and even to their own detriment, for these sort of moral grandstandings over again a Buddha statue with no connection to any with I would doubt anyone in the United States or Western Europe or the Western world in general. But again, that's beside the point.
Right. And so what I want to say is, assigning everything that America does as a great 4D chess move and trust the plan, like it's a leftover from the Trump era. I mean, a lot of it is like, you know, um, great powers, global homo, whatever you want to call it, can make mistakes. They can take L's, right? You can also make the comparison that, yeah, America could, do a lot more in Afghanistan, but does it have the ruthlessness to do it? I mean, a lot of that ruthlessness it has kind of gone since since the end of World War II. Uh,
Oh, of course. Since I would
you
say,
can
okay, since Korea, there has not been a willingness by the United States to treat an enemy as an enemy. Because during World War II, we are at war with the nation of Japan, not the Japanese government, not Emperor Hirohito or Tojo or whatever. And oh, the people are good; they're secretly on our side. We just got to go save them. Whereas you got that mindset in Vietnam, in the interventions in the Middle East, even with our rhetoric towards China nowadays, our rhetoric towards sometimes Russia, depends on who you ask. Sometimes the Russians are all just like evil bastards, but other times like oh they're Putin has his heel on their neck. But point being is, I would say since World War II Korea, you've gotten this mentality in the United States, again, sort of this messiah complex, where we're not at war with these nations. It doesn't matter what these individual people think. They're still subject to these nations and are going to fight on behalf of them. But no, it's like, oh, they're secretly on our side. I mean, you read some of the orders that Bush gave even during the first Iraq War, Bush Sr., that is, like proclamations of freedom to the Iraqi people and the Kurds to rise up against Saddam Hussein, of course, which were not honored agreements. But point being is, it wasn't that, okay, we're at war with Iraq, they attacked something vital to us, they're threatening the global oil trade, so we don't care if you like Saddam, we don't care if you're a Sunni, Shia, Kurd, whatever, if you're in Saddam's army, you're an enemy of ours, or if you're, actively working with the Iraqi state, you're an enemy of ours, which if you're fighting a war, I don't understand. Look, I understand reaching out the distance and exploiting internal conflicts, but I don't understand how any serious country can approach this from the angle that, well, you see, the people are just secretly on our sides. Or, again, to go back to that quote from Full Metal Jacket. Of course, I'll have to make it more YouTube friendly because inside every Vietnamese is an American screaming to get out. Again, it's this sort of mentality that against this universal idea. It's this, it can be applied anywhere, and not that, well, okay, Americans are a distinct people with their national and imperial interests, and they just so happen to stand in our way. And you know what? I don't care what their personal views may be. I don't care what they think about America or whatever. So long as they're that line of fire, they're the enemy. And you listen to, again, I don't want to get on too much of a tangent, but especially interviews with World War One veterans. There's a couple. There's a really good one on YouTube with a German who speaks almost perfect English, by the way, describing his experiences in the trenches, talking about like, well, I had no personal animosity towards these French people, but they were the enemy and they stood in the way of Germany's interests, so I had to bayonet them. And it really is like, it's this sort of pie in the sky, head in the clouds mentality of universalism versus the reality of actually doing what needs to be done. And I would say that's a stark contrast, and that's from the 60s onward, from the mid 60s onwards, even among the American top brass, at least the people in charge of the war, the politicians, which I would say bled into the Pentagon. It's the idea that, well, of course we're the international saviors, of course we're the liberators of these people, not that, well, we're fighting a war for America's either A, national or B, imperial interest. Look, you can criticize a lot of the American empire does, but at a certain point, I say it's better to fight for imperial interests than some vague extractions like human rights or democracy.
Right, but that is America's identity, so it,
True,
it
true.
is it is fixed
Again,
to that. And
it does get muddled. But I'm talking about like possibly like when there was still like maybe Vietnam, like when there was still something of an American identity that you could appeal to versus again the more abstract ideas. But again, I think you get what I'm getting at, right?
right. No, I do understand it, but America in many ways is the only country on an ideological level post World War II, and its outcome that could be the let's say the quote unquote legitimate global empire or
Fair.
policeman of the world, whatever you like, simply because all the other modals of governance were considered obsolete. Like World War II, in many ways, more low key, spelt the end of monarchies, or that dominated before. Certainly, the idea of a fascist state, like it. In the same way that liberalism was vindicated against communism with the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean that is the narrative, and America has always been criticized for in fact being already too imperialistic, right? So that's their fate. That's America's fate. Those are its origins. That is, like, you can't have it both ways. You can't appeal to being the liberator of the world and at the same time to being a kind of let's say a totalitarian empire of the world. But just to tie this together, so my argument basically is to put this into a historical context and not to go adrift with my 4D chess moves, because like oh, they're just sowing chaos, y'all. Like, chaos is going to come to Afghanistan anyways, right? And all the big players know it. They basically want less of what's happening in Afghanistan to go out, and besides, like, if the chaos is already going to be there, why would you humiliate yourself in order to do it? Like, but that doesn't look like you're reading the situation very well, does it? And I simply can't believe that the American intelligence and the Pentagon would be that stupid. I don't accept that. So my argument is that I think what happened at Bagram is some kind of sectarian division. I don't know if it's in the Biden administration or it's a struggle between, let's say, the Pentagon and Biden, and Biden's decision to pull out. Because there's also growing evidence. I didn't get a chance to read it very well. That Trump basically, in the way he designed his pullout, while in some ways it might have been more successful, in other ways it kind of implied that he never fully intended to leave Afghanistan. So Biden's withdrawal is probably even more than the Pentagon had expected. Anyhow, this is still speculation. I should note, but it is something to think about. Um, so I'm going to stay with tentatively that this was a decision, and to do this, it would cause great harm, you know, uh, especially to America's reputation and the reputation of the West. Uh, Merkel's upset. Borrell from the UN is saying that this is, the worst event in a century for humiliating the West and America. Our reputation is at stake, and of course, what you just mentioned with the British Parliament. Um, I would say that, let's say, given that the media, not necessarily when Biden is being interviewed, because when he is, a lot of the questions are kind of softball. Although I will say that, let's say when Tapper was talking to Blinken, Tapper was more direct. Now, they can't go too hard on Biden the way they did on Trump for many reasons, but the biggest reason is, the idea that like the power in America is elsewhere in the White House. If it looks like the media points to where the power is coming from too well, then that's a worse scenario. But the fact is, in printed articles and articles that are appearing on the net, in text, the condemnation is stronger than it is, let's say, at a presser, let's say at a briefing or an interview with either Blinken or with Biden. What this tells me is there's a part of the American elite that is not happy about leaving Afghanistan. That they think it's not time, and I would argue if you're gonna go with the argument that America went in to keep tabs on Iran, not that Iran was like really projecting its power very well. It was trapped in a 10-year war with Iraq, and it was honestly, and then even more sanctions were piled on afterwards.
Oh, of course.
So
And
like,
I mean, it took the
and
Iranians
so
throughout
if I
the
can,
90s and early 2000s to recover from the Iran-Iraq War, which ended in '89. It was a tough go ahead, and the fact that the Iranians are where they are today is actually very impressive. But another point I wanted to get out with what you were saying with some of the internal divisions is people always meme about like, oh, the coming civil war, America's on the verge of breaking apart. Now, I do think the American regime is on the verge of breaking apart in terms of like what I always touch on, apathy. I think people are just disengaging from the system. But I will say definitively, I do believe right now, and since Trump, but I think this Afghanistan story has made it plain as day, we are in the middle of a full blown institutional civil war. The people who run the
yes,
empire
yeah.
cannot agree, cannot come to a common ground for the life of them. The Pentagon hates the intelligence agencies hate the White House hates Congress, Congress hates everyone. Again, the media is also again one of those groups that's hated by everyone. They're pissy at whoever. But point being is, all the institutions, all the people who actually make the important decisions in society are at each other's throats right now. The most powerful people in the empire
Mm-hmm.
cannot stand
Mm-hmm.
each other. Usually, of course, they'll have their
Yes.
disagreements. You'll hear about this particularly between the military and intelligence, but they can overcome that. They can put aside differences for the greater goals of the empire. But we're getting to the point where the empire has fallen into such a state of disarray where these institutions, these fiefdoms, if you will, are baying for blood. And I would say, really, and again, like I said, I hate to give time frames because of what I went into last episode. They are pretty much taking what they can get while they can get it. The CIA wants what the CIA wants. The Pentagon wants what the Pentagon wants. The White House wants what the White House wants. The media wants, etc. I think you get the point. But again,
Right.
you're
Right.
seeing
Right.
all this unfold where, of course, the American plebeians will be at each other's throats about vaccine restrictions or not, or again Trump or Biden or things that look, they are important to a degree, but are much more trivial in the grand scheme of things when you consider all that's going on. Whereas, again, the people who actually have the abilities to make change are about ready to both figuratively and literally tear each other apart.
Right. And like just consider the probability of making grave mistakes and a sectarian division forming too strongly in the United States. For instance, right, like um, that process from the Democrat Party to demonize let's say white working middle class, particularly white males, right? That was always part of the strategy outlined by the Clinton administration, and I'm not implying that Republicans, ever defended the white middle class. But what I will say is that when this sort of, looting of that class was not happening fast enough, then, Obama basically in his second term had to vilify an entire race and just say, well, they're racist. So if they lose their wealth, all the better. And now they're really quite open about it. After Trump, they really have all the, like, they don't think that there ought to be any consequences for their words, like they really believe from the onset. And so, what I mean by this a workable model for America? Is it really workable? So, if America is willing to like do something so stupid on like on one level, uh, you know, stupid, yes, but let's say if you're one of these power climbers, it makes perfect sense what you're doing. It's completely logical. But why can't that happen? Why can't that kind of decision making spill over into when it comes to say the Pentagon or pulling out of Afghanistan, or and as I'm beating this horse to death, Bagram, right? So that's basically what I'm suggesting is that there something has happened. This was very pivotal. It should never have happened. And are we ever going to, is the American government really ever going to talk about this? And so that's all I'm going to say about background.
Oh, of course. I think that all leads up to it. And again, just going back to the institution of civil war point, you were talking about the demonization of the bitter clingers, as Obama would have called them. They cling to their religion, their guns, their whatever. And again,
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
it did require that demoralization, demonization of the, let's admit it, backbone of society. Now, of course, if you are a white professional class liberal man, quote unquote man, you're all good. You know, you work in Silicon Valley or you work on you know, some boardroom or even just some regular desk jockey. No, that's completely fine. Of course, if you're a professional white woman, that's all the better. Professional minority, professional LGBTQCIA, that all stacks up together. And again, it makes perfect sense why the Clinton administration onwards pursued this strategy. But I would say, and what do I know? I'm just a guy with an internet show. It seemed incredibly short-sighted with what they'd want to do, and maybe it's because they didn't anticipate, for example, the rise of countries like Russia and China, at least to the degree that they did, and how rapidly it happened. Or again, maybe they didn't anticipate, for example, Afghanistan turning out like this. But I do have to say, what I think we're seeing is also just Afghanistan, everything in general, the state of the institutions is a culmination of about 30 or so years, I would say, since the early 90s, of systemic short sightedness thinking, of course we can get away with this. This is, this will work right away. There'll be no consequences down the road. And I do think in a way, maybe not Trump exactly, but you did get this sort of co-opting of Trumpism to, because I think there were some elements in the empire, what I'm getting at, trying to bring these people back in the fold. Of course, you're welcome in society. Of course, we can LARP like it's like you're still important. Like being white is okay. Like being marginally Christian, so long as you're an evangelical Protestant Zionist, is okay. Look, though that's all cool, and you might think of the conservative ink types or the alt light as they became known. A lot of those sort of people who they dragged in. But again, I think what you're getting at is perfect, and I think what you're also getting at is that this is really a beast that is destroying itself from the inside out. And I know I keep on harping on this point, but I think it's important. I don't think many people realize that because I think they think of the system, the globalist American empire, the deep state, the cathedral, whatever the hell you want to call it, as a hegemonic monolith. While it may be hegemonic, at least in terms of geopolitics and even society, it is anything but monolithic, as I'm getting into. Now, I think there was a point where it could have at least acted monolithic, could have at least acted towards a common goal, and I still do think to a degree it can. I think it's trying to right now, but I think we're seeing that fall apart in real time, where the people in charge of X, Y, and Z institution are starting to view X, Y, and Z institution, and again, their own bottom line as much more important than the system itself. That they no longer want to be a part of the system, they want to be the system, or they want their fragment of the system to survive what they know is coming. And I think that is a lot of the attitudes we're seeing right now. I think that explains, even in retrospect, going back to the Trump administration, a lot of the schizophrenic behavior from the American empire during the Trump administration, the entire Biden administration with all the people in there, and again, all the conflicting narratives that come out of the Biden administration, again, and to hammer on these points again, Pentagon, CIA, intelligence agencies, media, etc., actual quote unquote elected politicians, and again, just from top to bottom, just all the bureaucrats, all the bureaucracies and agencies, whatever you want to call them. Again, I think
Hmm.
at least the people from mid level on realize that they are in a much more dire situation than they would have thought they were in, say, even 4 years ago, and are really scrambling to pretty much save themselves and save the people around them. Again, I'm repeating myself at this point, but I think it's worth saying. And you see how that spills out into the governance of the empire on both domestic and foreign issues. And I think, in retrospect, looking back for
Yeah.
the entire time we've done the show, that is probably the most succinct way I can put the state of American foreign policy since 2017, if not sooner. I think you saw the preliminary cracks of this under Obama, with Obama's policies towards Libya and Syria, and arguably even towards Russia and Ukraine. And we'll get into some of the Nord Stream 2 stuff in a minute here, but
Yes.
I do think those cracks started under Obama. I think 9/11 broke the illusion of a unified society, of course, because they were running all these ops since the 90s, if not before, I would say. Again, the easiest place to put the blame is the American Cultural Revolution of the 60s, but again, when we're talking about like actually putting pen to paper with plans, I'd say the 90s. But I think 9/11, again, going back to this, and we'll of course get into this in our show we have planned for the 20th anniversary, was the one that blatantly broke the confidence of the public. Now, how involved and how complicit the regime was in that, I really can't say for sure. But point being is, even if it is something they anticipated or allowed to happen or even participated in themselves, I don't think by any means they could have seen the long-lasting consequence, which I would argue everything we're seeing now with all the things I described are
Yes.
the long-lasting
Yeah.
consequences of that. And 20 years is even a bit too short to call long-lasting consequences. But here's the thing: it's probably only going to get worse. At least from their perspective. From our
Right.
perspective, I see great opportunity. Of course, the apathy approach, I will hammer that home. Of course, I advocate for no action at all. And I just like to put that out there every once in a while. I like to have my alibis out there, even though they can probably selectively edit this and incriminate me if they want to. But you know what? If I go down, I go down. It's been nice knowing you all. But as you were saying,
somebody's gonna somebody's gonna splice your voice and go, and it'll start with, "I'm about to get politically incorrect."
oh boy, that's enough to get you hanged. After a legal
Yeah.
trial, of course, I would never advocate for any violence. See, I'm so touchy now. I really want to diversify platforms. I know there's people in the comments always talk about these different platforms I should go to. I think I'll probably look into it this weekend or the next to look into that because, man, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells every time I use a so-called controversial word. And we only have 800 subscribers and only a few hundred of you watch it. I love you all. Don't get me wrong. I'm glad you enjoy the content, but we're not very big on the grand scheme of things. I'm still walking on eggshells like this. We really need to diversify, so to speak. But that's aside the point.
No, you know what? I'm really glad you made that point, because, like, the very reason to go into Afghanistan in itself, if it is what we think it is, given the evidence, then that demonstrates the level of incredible hubris and ambition, such a horrible cocktail, right? That it more than explains bad decision making, right? Like, if you want to argue that America went in, um, at a time where it was appropriate to block China and to block, like, well, they went in very early. They went in too early, which is why they still wanted to stay there, right? Um, let's say if you're talking about cobalt and lithium, for battery and for computers and stuff, in 2001, that wasn't the market it is now, right? So that's very early. Um, Also, they were not in a position. China wasn't as strong an economic power 20 years ago as it is now. And Iran, I argue, could never take advantage of Afghanistan. The best they could do was defend a minority Shia group that was always beleaguered and attacked by Sunnis. And so, as I say, the reason they wanted them to stay there longer is kind of like the real peak period came later. Uh, Especially with smartphones, I would say the peak period happened kind of around the time of the first smartphone, the first Apple phone, and that's around the time that Osama bin Laden was apparently killed, right, in a different country. So, if you want to go with our argument, okay, but that means like for them to really disrupt that, they would have to stay in there, right? Because these countries now are far more capable of taking advantage of that area. And anyway, so we'll see how it goes. Again, I argue that if you're talking about China getting in, the Wakhan Valley there is like it would take a long time to make like to turn that into a trade route. I mean, whatever the ambitions are, that's a long-term project, and to settle Afghanistan is itself a very long-term project. So, anyways, we don't always know like
Yeah, to put
what
it
are
in
the rival.
perspective, there are greater prospects in China to the point where they'd rather go through these efforts in sub-Saharan Africa than they would in Afghanistan. Just put in perspective.
Right. Like as long as they don't see Americans disturbing their trade routes, as long as they don't see like a blockade happening, the kind that happened to Japan prior to World War II, um, I don't think the Chinese are in a rush. To be perfectly honest,
In fact, there's some
um,
degree of benefit they have from not having to defend these, especially sea routes. Now, again, we're talking more so about land routes, but there is somewhat of a benefit to the point where America and the American empire can do the heavy lifting for the time being while China invests in the actual infrastructure and the actual trade mechanisms before they actually have to guard it themselves. So you could say that even going back to the sort of Brzezinski worldview, there is a benefit that China gets from that, at least from the time being. Now, I think long term, they don't plan on relying on America for security forever, as you could probably guess by the past few years here. But point being is, like, even, especially if we're talking about early, mid 2000s, even I would say up until 2015, China certainly benefited from, again, having the American forces deal with that rather than having to bear the burden themselves.
yeah, yeah, and I don't know. Did you want to talk about Biden's speech at all, or
Certainly,
you
I'm,
know,
I'm
I
sure we can fit that in before Nord Stream. I think we got plenty of time here, so I can see you're eager to talk about it, so I'll let you take over from here.
Yeah, so I think Biden's speech was interesting. Besides his gaffe, thinking that it had already been 4 or 5 days later, in a way, he was given a softball question and he messed it up. And you can see that no one is there to defend him. There's nobody by his side. Uh, Kamala is nowhere to be found. She's recorded it saying, I'm not taking on this shit," or words to that effect. Pardon my language. Um, so there's a kind of interesting, like as I said earlier, they're trying to be critical, but at the same time, after such a momentous year last year with the election, right? They cannot afford to go hard on him. In fact, if you go to the CNN YouTube replies, there's that goof who does the Point show, and he was kind of more critical in a kind of in his editorial of Biden, and the comments like they're turning on CNN as if it was like the MAGA people turning on CNN, and um, so it's very careful, what Biden was trying to do in that speech. He was trying to make it seem as if people were asking whether getting out of Afghanistan was a good idea or not. And it's like people aren't asking that. Like the political will to be there and the popular support already died, right? Like consider how it had 90% approval in the beginning and how it had so much disapproval, particularly after Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan, according to the official report. Um, so he tried to make it all about that when really the question repeatedly over and over again whether it was with Blinken or whether it was in the speech with Biden. The question was, how could the pullout have been like this bad, right? Which is hence why I thought we should talk about Bagram. And he doesn't really answer that, and he starts blaming Trump. He starts blaming Russia and China. He starts blaming the Afghan government that they already alienated anyways. Um, that they handpicked, as I mentioned in the last report. Um, Ghani, Ghani's gone, but Ghani did not win the election. He came fourth, and the guy who did win, Abdullah, was made a minister. So, like, you have control over this. Like, you can ask what the hell is going on, but you yourself are like evacuating the place. And you look at that July 8th interview that Biden gave and said there's no chance that the Taliban are just going to own all of Afghanistan. 300,000 versus 70,000 Taliban, all of that stuff. And then, like, in in 2 weeks, Bagram is deserted. Like, it makes no sense. And so I would say he's trying to do this. The media is trying to be kind, but they cannot afford to. Because I think there's a double whammy here. You have other people who did not want to leave Afghanistan, who think, like, for various reasons, none of them official reasons, it's more important that America stays in Afghanistan now than ever before. From a geopolitical point of view, strategically, you would want them there now, right? That's what I think a lot of elites think about this. They are afraid that leaving and letting chaos work its magic in stopping, China, Iran, Pakistan, and Russia from having a say. Even the UN, Barella actually said that we cannot have any more influence of China and Russia in Afghanistan. He's irate. Um, that shows a lack of confidence. Now, the lack of confidence might be misplaced, but I would say it's still very early to tell exactly what's going to happen. And the other thing that the speech, I think, uh, uh, basically uh, tried to do was to portray Biden in a good light. Like, his speech, anyways, was successful. He did not stumble the way he always does. Virtually any time he speaks, it's incoherent, completely incoherent. But you could not say, no matter how much you disagreed with him, and I did, that he was incoherent. He wasn't. This came off very well. But as I said last week, you notice that he did not take any questions at all. Um, so I think this is. I'm seeing more and more articles talking about confidence. They do want to pin this on. This is a fiasco. This is a major fiasco, and it's going to bear itself on leadership. They have the interns, sorry, the primaries, beginning in about 7-8 months. I guess that's when you guys will have them, the very first ones. And then before you know it, it'll be 2023, and the first rumblings of a new election will already be felt. So what does that bode for the future? Anyhow, so that's what I had to say about the speech. You're not quite sure whether they want to condemn him, but they want to be careful not to, or that they want to be fairly conciliatory, but still act kind of like within a journalistic framework of the old kind. But he keeps putting his foot in his mouth. It's it's an interesting development.
Truly, the accelerationist candidate. We should have been able to see this from the
Yeah.
beginning. But getting into what you were saying about Blinken and other officials acting irate, I would say this is the first time in quite some time, if ever really, there is genuine open panic. Now, you can tell when these people are not confident in their decisions. You can tell when they might be a little nervous, but it looks like open and outright panic from the regime in front of the cameras, to the point where the American people can see this. I think they've lost all pretense. I think they know what kind of situation they're in. They realize, well, everyone knows how bad it is, so if you get a little rowdy on air, I don't think anyone will care or blame you. Now, again, I don't expect this to improve the situation. Like, this is one of those situations, I know we've tracked a lot of these for a while, where it only gets worse the more time goes on. And
Yeah,
I have a feeling, I mean, this story's going to stick with us at least through the end of the year, if not longer. And they're going to try their damnedest to memory hole it, but I don't think they're going to, just because of how significant it is. I think this puts a whole new angle on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which will make that show even more complex than it needs to
yeah,
be. Where, what do you think the atmosphere is going to be on September 11th, 2021? What do you think it's going to be with the
completely depressed.
it's going to well, I mean, like, you're going to have, like, of course, like, among the populace, it's going to be that way, but it is going. I do not see a shred of order taking place in any of the institutions on that day, because I think it'll be, again, not to cheapen or trivialize the actual attack itself, but I think in terms of what it will look like to the regime, I think it will be almost as big as a black eye as the actual attacks were, with the fallout of it, with it being the symbolic 20th anniversary, and who knows what events will unfold over the next 3.5, 4 weeks here. That, I mean, because I think you're foolish if you think the situation is getting better from here. I see no way in which it improves in their favor, at least. And I think the 20th anniversary will go down in history as one of the most pivotal days in the American Empire. I'm saying that already, and I don't think the atmosphere among the elite is going to be very good, and I think they're going to make pretty big fools out of themselves, so to speak, especially when so many of these politicians and figures are expected to show up at public events, and you already had that dust up with Biden and the survivors' families. Now, of course, they recanted because Biden gave them some token of cooperation. Now, we'll see how that lasts. But again, I would say even under early Trump, I don't think we've gotten to the disunity to the point where people would be, like, angry that the president or the vice president or some prominent politician of X, Y, or Z party shows up to one of these memorials. And I'm not saying I think it's going to get to this point this year, but I could see some. I don't see outright protesting, but I could see some discontent with, for example, Biden going to the World Trade Center memorial, or Kamala going to one of the memorials. They usually send the vice president, or they sent Mike Pence to the Shanksville Memorial. So I could see the discontent rise. Like I said, I don't think it would amount to open protest, especially on a day like that. But I could see certainly a lot of discontent, much more than you expect from what is theoretically a day of national unity, is what they tell us. But again,
Right.
I don't see it getting any better for them. I think the situation is going to continue to metastasize. And I will briefly mention before we go into Nord Stream 2, there were Israeli strikes on Syria in all of this chaos, of course. The Israeli strikes on Syria continue, which makes me think a theory we formulated a while ago, like early war report, like 2018, was when Israel launched strikes on Syria, when Israel takes its own military action, it is an implicit disapproval of Washington's foreign policy. I think that holds as true as ever right now.
Mm,
That
mm,
Israel is saying,
yes.
"Well, look what you're making us do. We have to conduct our own military actions now. Why aren't you doing this? We have no confidence in you." Is pretty much what Tel Aviv is saying to Washington right now, and that, of course, is under the new Bennett government. Look, as happy as I am that Netanyahu is out, I'm almost disappointed we didn't get to see his reaction to the situation, at least in the office of Prime Minister. There is a slight bit of disappointment about that, I will admit. However, I do think among the Israeli establishment, with that being said, that there is probably an extreme amount of discontent with Washington. We talked about some of the consequences in NATO. We talked about Taiwan. But I do think Israel, it was already suffering blows since the surge of Iran and the ISIS crisis, with the Iranians really asserting themselves in places like Iraq and Syria and Yemen. But I think on top of that, even, and with the Biden administration's approach towards Iran, that it goes to a whole new level with the way you see the Israelis reacting right now. And I expect them to be much more boisterous. I expect them to be much more bold in places like Syria. I wouldn't expect I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some again second push in the Palestinians. And then again, they're probably side eyeing Egypt and Jordan, thinking that, well, hey, if this great global empire can't keep Afghanistan under control, how much longer are the bribes going to keep going to the Egyptians and the Jordanians, as we were discussing last episode? And again, I can only imagine the mood in the Israeli government right now is probably just as about as heavy, if not more heavy, than that of the United States government. And again, the strikes in Syria were nothing major in terms of what we'd seen before. It's pretty routine as far as the Syrian war goes and the conflict in that part of the world goes. But I do think symbolically what they represent in light of all of
Yeah.
this is that Israelis are saying it's about to get bad. It is about to get really bad.
Right. And it also comes on the heels of just the day before the strikes today, five Syrian soldiers were killed in Daraa, the region bordering the Golan Heights. It's where the so-called Arab Spring uprising took place, which is a gay op, anyways. Um, it's south of Damascus. Now, the Syrians did go in there to reinforce that region because there's a holdout of several hundred rebels who said that they weren't going to fight anymore a few years ago, and now they're saying they are going to go fight. And basically, what the Russians and the Syrians want is them to disarm and go to Idlib. They don't want to go to Idlib. And I also think, one of the other things is when there's a bad casualty rate happening for the Syrian army, as an extra morale, you know, a dump on morale, the Israelis will attack. And it doesn't matter if like 70% of their missiles are all intercepted anyways, and the damage is minimal or no one is killed. It's there to, um, you know, tell the people that, you're kind of under an occupation, right? You're kind of like Palestinians thinking you can have your own land.
It's certainly a
Um,
power
I
move.
think, mhm, it is. We can do this with impunity, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, the other big news, well, two other pieces of news outside, sorry, in Syria, is that an officer was killed in that desert region. I guess roughly close to Palermo, like in that area south of the Euphrates. Um, and the other bit of news is the Russians blew up the headquarters of HTS. That's all I have for Syria at the moment.
I figure it was worth briefly touching on. And moving on from that, Nord Stream 2. Now, as we record this, it is the night of August 19th. And when you watch this, probably it'll be August 20th. It is estimated that Nord Stream 2 will be complete on August 23rd, which is, as big brain Twitter users let us know, the anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. No joke, no joke. It's the angle they're taking, and they're saying, of course, oh, it's all symbolic. Germany and Russia are at it again. They're going to subjugate Poland. They're going to subjugate the free peoples of Eastern Europe. Of course, and the Polish defense minister outright made the comparison that this is like Molotov-Ribbentrop, and then and it is just salt on top of salt because they thought they had at least the slightest chance to delay or, in fact, push back Nord Stream 2 when Biden came into office. But Biden turned out to do the exact opposite. He was actually softer on it than Trump was. Not that Trump was particularly soft on it, but still. And Biden says, I don't care, leaves the Ukrainians to their own devices. Again, with all of that being said, you have this really watershed moment. I would say this has been a year of watershed moments. I would say 2021. Now, of course, a lot of what happened in 2021 is contingent on 2020, as every year is. But I would say so far, with about a quarter of the year left, 2021 has been more pivotal than 2020. 2020 was pretty pivotal. I can only imagine what our end of the year show is going to look like with 3.5 months of news still in store. But we'll get to that
Hmm.
when we get to that. And like Nord Stream 2 was theoretical for a long time. It was 90% complete, it was 95% complete. But we're just mere days away from the grand opening, to the point where this will actually start to have effects. And throughout the rest of this year, we'll see how it affects the energy markets, how it affects especially heating and gas prices in Europe, in Germany in particular, which, pardon the pun, I think could lead to a much warmer relationship between Europe and Russia if the projections are met, if not exceeded. Now, again, I don't know how that is going to play out. I can't imagine that it's going to underperform at least. So, but so long as these expectations are met, I can only imagine that hostility with Russia from the European powers. Now, of course, this isn't the first time Russia's ever sold oil and gas to the European powers, but again, with the expansion of these markets, no less, I only have a feeling things are going to get less and less tense, which is going to drive more and more of a divide between the U.S. and Europe, who are already in dire straits. The relationship is already fractured at the seams. And again, we're also on the eve of another migrant crisis on top of approaching German and French elections. So it is. We've seen
Yeah, it's a good,
we've
it's a
seen
good
the
thing Americans are in Germany.
Oh, yes, of course. But we've seen the drifting away of Europe and America, I would say, since the end of the Cold War, very starkly after Iraq, very starkly in late Obama, early Trump. And I would say this is one of those things that is going to be another driving wedge, in that Biden will, in retrospect, between the past 5 presidents we've had since the end of the Cold War onwards, will probably be remembered the most for driving that wedge between the U.S. and Europe, with the amount of Russian encroachment in Europe at this point in the energy markets. And again, it's it's almost surreal to see the world you were born into, because again, my entire memory is from the post Cold War era. I know old timers like you can remember, well, like the 19 somethings. Now I'm not that lucky, unfortunately. I'm sure our audience is probably a fair mix of all of that. But again, this entire world, all the preconceived notions I grew up with, are unraveling one by one in real time. And thanks to the wonders of modern technology, not
Mhm.
only do I get to watch this, I get to do what I'm doing right here and document it.
Right. I mean, I'm seeing the birth of a third world order. It was born during I order matured uh, early 20s, uh, near the end of it, and uh, and now then there was what I would call like the American hegemonic order, stretching from 1990 to roughly where we are now, but it's already weakening now. So yeah, it's a development. Um, you don't think it would move that, to be honest, the Global Order was like, it was a long, long time. I was born in Yugoslavia. We were here for decades before all of that fell apart. So there was an expectation that would go on for much longer.
Which was also seemingly overnight.
But
And again, that's one of the other things that people have been grilling the intelligence agencies for, that they didn't foresee the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I am willing to actually give them some credit on, because I don't think many people did. I mean, again, you were saying, as somebody who came from the other side of the Iron Curtain, you didn't see it. And again, I don't imagine many of the Soviet leaders
no.
even saw it, even back when Gorbachev first came to power. And again, it does seem like, at least I would say from the mid 19th century onward, you get this trend of empires and world orders just seemingly dying overnight. Now, of course, there are periods of difficulty and decline, but when pen is put to paper, it seems like it died overnight. Like, you can give a definitive date to when, again, the great empires that collapsed during World War One died, because, of course, the peace trees, the certain dates. You can again put pen to paper on when, of course, the Third Reich collapsed, when the Soviet Union collapsed, etc. Whereas historically, when you had these great empires, for example, you want to go as far back as Rome, there was no definitive date where Rome actually collapsed. It was something that just played out. There was no definitive date when, for example, the Spanish colonial empire collapsed. It just slowly played out. And again, I don't know if it's a product of industrial civilization. I don't know what it's a product of, but where maybe not exact times and dates, but you can give at least a general framework, like narrow it down to a year when an empire collapsed.
Mhm. Yeah, and kind of like orders because like for some of for some, you're as you say, it's more gradual. Like the 20th century was a century where Britain went from an empire to a country. A country with considerable influence, but a country nonetheless. Um, and something similar happened to Russia, but less of a degree, because Russia, just being much larger, can project itself over a wider area.
And still more domination
Than
outside of its, I would say, like historic territory. If you compare that to like Muscovy in versus modern day Russia, again, you would expect like a British style collapse
yeah,
of Russia for it to be like the Moscow metropolitan area and maybe a few hundred miles around it. Like if we were like comparing it to like the British collapse, whereas you still have the Far East, Siberia under that control, much of the Caucasus still under Russian
yeah,
control, all stretching into Central Asia, and again even some parts of like Eastern Europe, for example, the annexation of Crimea, the current developments with Belarus to the point where, yeah, Russia did experience a collapse. They experienced a severe collapse with the fall of the empire and the Soviet Union, but nowhere compared to, for example, the British Empire or the French Empire.
yeah. Well, and as you said, the Spanish. But as long as we're talking about Europe and Nord Stream 2, I should mention about a week and a few days ago, there was basically bending of the knee on Poland's. It's very unfortunate, Poland's part to the EU. The question had down to like the supremacy of constitutions and judicial practices, and the EU has been complaining that Poland cannot continue to appoint judges, select the kind of judges that it's selecting, and make rulings, and even punish, or what kind of punishment can those judges receive based on Poland's constitution and Poland's historic traditional judicial practice. That the EU constitution and its laws and its judiciary, they trump all of it. Now, Poland said a few years ago, as this was becoming a problem, that it would leave the EU before this would happen.
And guess what
Of course,
happened?
that's yeah, right. And what this does is it leaves Orban completely alone.
Yeah, I was actually just about to bring that up, that Hungary is now an island within the European Union. Now, Hungary had the foresight not to close itself off to the east, so to speak. For example, their relations with Russia and China are much more
Yeah,
warmer than Poland's relations with these powers of the east, if you will. And again, it does leave him alone. It leaves him alone and to deal with powers outside of Europe, and it forces Hungary to become either capitulate like Poland did or become more of an Eastern country. Because for all his faults, again, Trump as an ally in Washington is gone. You had Orban called a totalitarian thug before Biden even came into office when he was still president elect. So it looks like
right.
Poland, because of their contentious relations with the Russians, has isolated themselves. And again, that's not even to say that the Poles should have become, again, a Russian territory again, but at least having those diplomatic channels open, at least playing both sides, especially in a country with the positioning of Poland, they could have really milked both those cows for all they were worth. And I mean, what the Russians wouldn't give to have Poland, quote unquote, in their sphere, what they wouldn't give to have that further encroachment into Eastern Europe. Now, again, I don't think it's quite as realistic, but point being is there was no effort even made on the Polish leadership to walk that tightrope. Whereas the Hungarians, actually the smaller country, maybe that's it. Maybe Hungary was smaller, less powerful, less significant, was able to get away with walking that tightrope more. And again, it does leave Orban alone, and I think it does come to a pivotal moment where maybe Hungary won't leave the EU, but it's going to at least set it down future paths. Like, are you going to choose the European Union or are you going to choose the East? Because I think if Hungary wants to continue down the nationalistic path it's on now, and again, criticize Orban, praise him, whatever, but the generally nationalistic path it's going down now, I think with the current capitulation of Poland, seeming capitulation of Poland, I could say, who knows, uh, they could pull it out last minute, but I doubt it. I think Hungary's either going to have to choose European Union or look eastward, and I really don't know how that would play out. I think again, Orban has a shelf life. He's a mortal man like the rest of us. He's not going to be in power forever. Who knows? There could be some electioneering, or he could make a major mistake that forces him out next election, or there could be a color revolution, or whatever. But coming down to the Hungarian people, the Hungarian political culture, it's going to become a day of reckoning where I think maybe the effects won't be immediate, but there's going to be a day where they're going to have to choose one or another. I think because I think with what they did to Poland shows that they're more than willing and more than able to do it to Hungary as well. And it's only a matter of time until they do, so long as the situation stay the same. Like I said, will Hungary leave the European Union? I doubt it's going to be anytime soon, but like I said, with the way time frames have been for me lately, I don't even want to hazard a guess like that, but I'm just going to, again, repeat the main point once again. There's going to be a day where they pick one or the other. This tightrope game cannot continue. You're also going to see something similar with Turkey like that.
Yeah.
They're going to have to pick one or another. The tightrope game cannot continue. One side or the other is going to, or if not both, are going to get fed up. And I couldn't hazard a guess because I know Orban is pretty rogue, so to speak, but it seems even far for him to forsake Europe. I think you'd need somebody even further than him to do that.
Right, right. You know, we've been saying on the show for a long while that that Poland really only has two options. It actually only has one option if it wants to be nationalistic, if it wants to serve itself, um, and not go the way of countries where its very identity will be at stake, and with a possible new crisis looming, the possibility of that happening is actually higher now. And one of the reasons that Poland probably stuck to the path that it has is that it's never felt the full weight of I don't want to say economic tyranny, but the kind of economic hardship the EU can enforce on a country. Now, it still has its own currency, like Hungary, but you know, it's hard to say how long it will have it, because if you capitulate on this, they're going to expect you to capitulate on several other things, and the more normalized the situation between Russia and the EU becomes, and not saying that it's going to be really normalized, but the more normalized it is, let's say compared to 2014 to 2016, the more that Poland is going to be expected to comply. And so it's going to have to make some concessions. It already, to reach this decision, it's already economically threatened, because there's the EU has some kind of Nordic loan thing that, like, I forget how exactly but countries like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Germany, like these northern countries in the EU, they will give out like 77 billion to help out the southern European countries. And they basically, told Poland, you're not getting any of it unless you comply.
Yeah, and I mean that deal is a
And
loan shark deal as it is. I mean, I'm not saying that the Greeks are completely faultless in this and the Italians are completely faultless in this, but
yeah,
again, it is responsible large that they offered them these loans that pretty much what China does. These loans that they cannot pay back, that are going to wreak havoc on the economy, that only gives us more leverage over you. And also getting on this point with the European Union, I wonder, and again, who knows at this point, what this will say to the potential states that are looking for integration into Europe, such as Ukraine, Moldova, the the Balkan states, Serbia, Bosnia. I know Montenegro joined NATO. Montenegro and Macedonia joined NATO. I think they've still been blocked from the European Union. But I wonder, with countries that are again much less significant than Poland, much smaller than Poland in both terms of territory and population, what message sends them? If they're going to do that to them, us who are relatively similar in a cultural sense, who are much more, who certainly have not embraced the liberalism of the West. Now, I'm sure it's seeped in there to some degree. But again, what does it say to them if they're going to do that to Poland? Is that really a system we want to be part of? Now, of course, there is ways to subvert the popular will. We saw this, in fact, with Ireland's ascent in the EU. They held referendums until the Irish finally caved and said yes. They rigged these referendums. They do all sorts of things. They do all sorts of trickery to get these countries integrated. But I do think that if they're wise, if there's some degree of, again, at least foresight, that these countries will see what happened to Poland and what is about to happen to Hungary and think, do we really want that? Is that really the path we want to go down? But who knows? I
hmm
think with the. It seems like the Balkan question and the Ukraine question, when it comes to European integration, are cans eternally kicked down the road. And I don't imagine with the current internal instability of the West that Macron or Merkel or whoever even want to touch those two questions right now, especially the Ukraine one.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that, like, again, I hate to say it, but we predicted this. We were hoping that Poland would find a way to play both sides, the way Hungary has managed to, the way Turkey has managed to. But Poland obviously is not confident it can do that. I don't think it's confident to, um, especially project a kind of narrative that would justify why they're doing. One of the reasons for that is probably because just how popular the EU is in Poland. It has like 82% of Poles want to be in the EU. And it is kind of like a badge of honor that they feel distinguishes them from Russia, that Poland is Europe, but
Oh,
Russia is not.
speaking of, I can't wait for Vile Varangian's take on this situation because we're having him on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Actually, we were originally going to have him on this Saturday. However, schedule conflicts, he's going to be on the next Saturday. And especially when we give the
Yeah.
situation a week or two to develop, I can only imagine he has quite the opinions on that, and I'm very excited to hear what he has to say about that.
Yeah, I don't know what other, like, I'm open, as the audience probably knows, it's a cuff because so much is going on, and it's very and interesting. And
You're kind of roboting on us.
sorry, how,
And as you were saying,
so just to think more about Afghanistan, and like I said, a bit off the cuff, but mentioning Oon's report. My friend Mario sent me. I know Carlin wrote about the popularity or the lack of popularity of the Taliban. Its popularity is it only reflects about 13.5% of the population. Uh,
despite being
it
13%
is
of the
actually.
population,
Oh God, nailed it. Yeah, despite being 30, it controls 100% of the country. So, um, It did say that about 55% of the Afghan public actually does believe women should be able to vote and work and so on. Um, and that most of the backing for the Taliban at the moment is that they're Afghanis. Big one. Well, I don't know why.
There's a
Literally,
similar phenomenon
why?
in Iran, I understand, whereas the younger population may be more willing to embrace these liberal ideals. They're willing to coalesce around a theocratic government so long as it's one of their own, rather than being, again, a toy of the international powers. So I think the sentiment is common in a
Yeah,
lot of Muslim countries where they will tolerate some of these more conservative religious governments if it means sovereignty.
yeah, definitely, definitely. And we are seeing. Should also be mentioned that I was hopeful last week, saying let's wait and see. I think this is a different Taliban. Maybe they have deals that they've been like trying to work out for years now. Uh, but no. So they've executed one of the generals of the Afghan army, and the other thing is okay. So they stopped one woman from being an anchor woman or anchor person on the news, but there's telltale signs that besides the chaos at the airport, there's telltale signs that they're probably going to coalesce more or less around to the kind of regime they were before. I would still say that they can pull back this, that they can uh, find a different direction. That these are still the heady days after the victory. I mean, it hasn't even been a week yet. So
Well, and also, as we discussed previously, will there be a. Again, you said a lot of the popular support for the Taliban was, again, the drive out the foreigner. Will there be a fracturing in Afghanistan again? Will I mean, you already had the Northern Alliance flag raised in where was it? Of course, somewhere in northern Afghanistan. But point being is, you already had some sort of
yeah.
quote unquote resistance rising up against the Taliban. I can only imagine that over the next few months, years, there probably will be fractionalizations. Will the Taliban be able to hold on to more or less power over the country? Who knows? But I wouldn't be surprised if we. I wouldn't go as far to call it a civil war, but saw some skirmishes among various factions in Afghanistan.
You're right. And actually, what might end up happening is you might have like kind of like an Iraq situation or a Syria, but it could be a situation that's less violent, where you have different countries maybe supporting economic different areas that one group tends to dominate over another group,
Yeah, like two or three states within
and
one
that
country, like what we see again with like Iraqi Kurdistan or like the Shia parts of Iraq or the Sunni parts of Iraq. Or I think
yeah,
Syria is the better example with the opposition Idlib, the Damascus government, the quote unquote SDF, where again it's technically at peace. I mean, well, Syria's not at peace, but again, like violence has died down a lot, but there's pretty hard borders between various faction controls, even though they aren't in outright civil war. I think that is probably the most likely possibility for Afghanistan. You bring that up again, you'll have the Taliban based out of wherever, and then of course the Northern Alliance or whatever you make of that is probably going to be one of them. And I can only imagine again various regionalist, ethnic, or tribal groups will pop up. So it could be a cold civil war in Afghanistan, so to speak, going forward.
yeah. I mean, it depends because the other thing to keep in mind, and this was the second point I wanted to make, is America has frozen Afghanistan's assets, right? Uh, Billions of dollars worth of gold is now locked, which is something that I knew would happen if there was a victory, which will only press the situation more towards Afghanistan relying on China, because I mean America is never going to give that money back. Uh, so I would say that really, I think it's something that even the Taliban was always well aware would happen if they should win. That was baked into into the cake. They cannot, you know, they would literally have to go more lib than what America. America was doing there for 20 years in order for them to get that money back, right? The largest minority would have to be basically kind of bullied around by the smaller minorities in order for this to work. Uh, they would have to reinstate. Like I saw a hilarious video where women are attending Kabul University, and they're wearing Muslim clothing, not the burqa, and having art teachers doing a slideshow presenting them Marcel Duchamp's toilet. Like, well, I always find this funny. I can't help it. Like America basically is like it's packaging the disintegration of a civilization in place of a civilization, something to strive for, right? Like you're going to Marcel absolutely deconstructs art. I even argue that the when found objects become art, essentially art is over in the West, and then a more pragmatic and materialist philosophy overtakes the civilization, and that's that. There'll be libraries of this sort of stuff, but even those are sort of being threatened now. Uh, and of course, movies are the art form, but even they are not that great anymore. So I
Excuse me,
would say that
TikTok is the art
in a
form,
thousand,
okay?
yeah, yes, yes. So the Taliban isn't going to go in that direction, and the Taliban needs China, and China needs the Taliban, essentially.
Yes, and like I
But
said, stratification and a cold
it's
civil
ripe for
war, I
fraction.
could certainly see, but I do think the Taliban and China will come to some sort of alliance of convenience to the point where, like I said, they already they almost did that before the initial invasion, so I could see with the Taliban trying to be
Yeah,
at least more open on an international level, being able to pull that off, but
yeah.
I suppose that's all we can
Well,
really say
well, a
about
few weeks ago they
Afghanistan for
were
the.
in
Oh,
Beijing.
go on, go on.
Yeah, well, a few weeks ago, the Taliban representatives were in Beijing and have asked for um, missiles. So
Well, oh boy. Yeah, we'll see how that plays out. But I suppose that's all the news about Afghanistan for now. And looking at the way it's
yeah,
going, we'll probably be recording an episode on Saturday night to put out on Sunday. But who knows at this point? I mean, man, is this gonna become like a twice, 3 times a week thing? I guess we'll just have to play it by ear, of course. Look out for that Vile Rangian episode coming out soon. And wow, our follow up episode, I did not expect this, especially around about the 40 so minute mark. I thought like, yeah, we could probably get an hour out of this. Yeah, we're at almost an hour 40. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the War Report, and my apologies for any technical difficulties or hiccups. But I mean, hey, we got it under control. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you probably sooner than you
yeah.
think. And goodbye.
Take care, guys.